In the prestigious Whitmore Memorial Foundation, where million-dollar donations flow like water and reputations are built on carefully crafted lies, one woman's desperate search for truth will expose a web of betrayal that reaches the highest levels of society. When Victoria Sterling discovers that her late sister's memorial wing has been systematically stripped of its most valuable artifacts, she realizes that the person she trusted to honor Elena's memory has been destroying it instead. But some secrets are worth killing for, and Victoria is about to learn that her sister's death might not have been the accident everyone believed it to be. In a world where charity galas mask criminal enterprises and philanthropists hide behind stolen identities, one woman's quest for justice will either restore her family's honor or destroy everything she has left to lose. The empty pedestal in Elena's memorial wing isn't just missing a sculpture, it's missing the truth. And Victoria Sterling is about to find out that some truths are buried for a very good reason. Victoria Sterling adjusted her black wool coat against the October wind as she approached the towering glass entrance of the Whitmore Memorial Foundation. The building stood like a monument to grief and generosity, its sleek modern architecture a stark contrast to the Gothic cathedral across the street. She hadn't visited Elena's memorial wing in 6 months, not since the painful anniversary ceremony that had left her hollow and exhausted. The security guard, Marcus, recognized her immediately. His weathered face softened with sympathy as he buzzed her through the main entrance. "Miss Sterling, good to see you again. I'm sorry it's been so long since your last visit." Victoria managed a tight smile. "Life has a way of keeping us busy, doesn't it, Marcus?" She paused at the reception desk, where a young woman with perfectly manicured nails looked up from her computer screen. "I'm here to see the Elena Sterling Memorial Wing." The receptionist's expression shifted slightly, something Victoria couldn't quite identify flickering across her features. "Of course, Miss Horse-Unburied. Sterling, would you like me to call Mrs. B. Bear Hartwell to escort you?" "That won't be necessary," Victoria replied quickly. Margaret Hartwell, the Foundation's director and Elena's former best friend, had been suffocating in her attention lately. Victoria needed this moment alone with her sister's memory. The memorial wing occupied the entire 3rd floor of the Foundation building. Victoria's heels clicked against the polished marble as she made her way through the familiar corridors. The walls were lined with photographs of Elena's humanitarian work, her bright smile beaming from behind orphaned children in Cambodia, flood victims in Louisiana, and refugees in Syria. Elena had lived her 32 years with a fierce dedication to helping others, pouring her inherited fortune into causes that mattered. Victoria pushed through the heavy oak doors that led to the main memorial hall. The space was designed to inspire contemplation, with soft lighting and carefully curated displays of Elena's personal effects, awards, and documentation of her charitable work. But something was wrong. The first thing Victoria noticed was the silence, not the respectful quiet of a memorial space, but an emptiness that felt almost hollow. She moved deeper into the room, her eyes scanning the familiar displays. The glass case that had held Elena's collection of handwritten thank you letters from the children she'd helped was empty, bearing only a small placard that read, "Display under renovation." Victoria frowned and moved to the next exhibit. Elena's Humanitarian of the Year award from the International Relief Organization was missing from its stand. Another renovation notice. Then another. And another. Her heart began to race as she discovered that nearly every personal item, every meaningful artifact that had made this space a true memorial to Elena's life and work, had been removed. The walls still held the photographs, but they felt like hollow ghosts without the personal touches that had made Elena feel present in this space. But it was the far corner of the room that made Victoria's blood run cold. The marble pedestal that had held Elena's most treasured possession, a small bronze sculpture of hands reaching toward each other, created by a young artist Elena had supported, stood completely empty. There was no renovation notice, no explanation, just empty space where something precious had once lived. Victoria pulled out her phone and dialed Margaret Hartwell's extension. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried the main office. "Mrs. Hartwell is in meetings all afternoon," the secretary informed her. "Would you like to schedule an appointment? This is Victoria Sterling. I need to speak with Margaret immediately about my sister's memorial wing." There was a pause. "I'll see if I can reach her, Ms. Sterling. Please hold." Victoria waited, her eyes continuing to catalogue everything that was missing. The room felt violated, stripped of its soul. When the secretary returned to the line, her voice carried an odd tension. "I'm sorry, Ms. Sterling, but Mrs. Hartwell is unavailable today. She asked me to tell you that the memorial wing is undergoing some updates and improvements. Everything has been carefully stored and will be returned soon." "Updates? What kind of updates? And why wasn't I consulted about this? I don't have those details, Miss Sterling. I can have Mrs. Hartwell call you tomorrow. Victoria ended the call, her hands shaking with anger and something deeper. A creeping fear that something was terribly wrong. She walked back through the memorial wing, this time looking more carefully at what remained. The photographs on the wall, she realized, were copies. The originals had been replaced with high-quality prints, but they lacked the subtle texture and depth of the original photographs. She stopped in front of Elena's desk, which had been preserved exactly as she'd left it the day before her death. Except now Victoria noticed that the small personal items, Elena's favorite pen, her leather-bound notebook, the small jade elephant that had belonged to their grandmother, were missing. Even Elena's reading glasses, which had always sat folded next to her computer monitor, were gone. Victoria opened the desk drawers, knowing she probably shouldn't, but driven by a growing panic. They were empty, completely empty, as if Elena had never worked there at all. She pulled out her phone again and called her lawyer, David Chen. He answered on the second ring. Victoria, what's wrong? You sound upset. David, I need you to check something for me. The Memorial Wing agreement we signed with the Whitmore Foundation. What exactly does it say about removing Elena's personal items? She could hear papers shuffling on the other end of the line. David had handled all the legal arrangements for the Memorial Wing after Elena's death. The Foundation has the right to maintain and update the displays, but any major changes or removal of personal items requires written notice to you as Elena's executor and heir. Why? Because nearly everything is gone, David. Elena's personal items, her awards, even the bronze sculpture. They're calling it updates and improvements, but nobody consulted me. David was quiet for a moment. That's a clear violation of the agreement. I'll send a formal inquiry to their legal department first thing tomorrow morning. Victoria continued walking through the space as she talked to David, her trained eye catching more discrepancies. She'd worked as an insurance investigator before inheriting Elena's estate, and something about the scene felt wrong in a way that went beyond mere unauthorized renovations. David, I'm going to document everything that's missing. Can you pull the original inventory list we submitted when we established the memorial? Of course. Victoria, is there something else going on here? She paused in front of a photograph of Elena receiving an award from the mayor. Even this seemed different somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on what had changed. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. After ending the call with David, Victoria spent another hour in the memorial wing, taking photographs of every empty display case, every missing item, every suspicious change. The foundation closed at 5, and she wanted to be thorough in her documentation. As she prepared to leave, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Margaret Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled. Her silver hair was pulled back in a hasty bun, and there were dark circles under her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite hide. Victoria, I didn't expect to see you here today. Clearly, Victoria replied coolly. Margaret, what happened to Elena's memorial wing? Margaret stepped into the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. We're making some improvements, as I'm sure my secretary explained. The displays were getting a bit dated, and you thought you'd strip away everything that made this a memorial to my sister without consulting me? That's not what we're doing.
Margaret's voice carried a strain that Victoria had never heard before.
Everything is being carefully preserved. We're simply updating the presentation. Victoria gestured to the empty bronze sculpture pedestal. Where is Elena's sculpture? The one created by Marcus Rivera, the young artist she supported? Margaret's eyes darted away from Victoria's gaze.
It's being cleaned and restored.
It will be back soon. I want to see the items that have been removed. I want to see where they're being stored. I'm afraid that's not possible right now. The storage area is being renovated as well. Victoria studied Margaret's face, noting the tells she'd learned to recognize during her years as an investigator. The slight twitch near her left eye, the way she avoided direct eye contact, the defensive posture. Margaret Hartwell was lying. Margaret, you were Elena's best friend. You spoke at her funeral about how much she meant to you, how you would honor her memory. What's really going on here? For a moment, Margaret's carefully constructed facade cracked, and Victoria saw something that looked like fear in her eyes. But then Margaret straightened, reasserting control. I think you're overreacting, Victoria. These kinds of updates are normal for memorial displays. I'll have a complete report sent to your office by the end of the week, detailing all the improvements we're making. Victoria knew she wasn't going to get any more information from Margaret tonight, but she also knew that something was deeply wrong with the situation. As she left the foundation building, she made mental notes of everything she'd observed, every inconsistency, every lie. Outside, the October evening was growing cold, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Victoria looked back up at the third-floor windows of Elena's memorial wing, now darkened and empty. Somewhere in this building, or perhaps somewhere else entirely, were the personal items that connected her to her sister's memory. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in months. "Frank, it's Victoria Sterling. I need your help with something. Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" Frank Morrison had been her partner when she worked insurance fraud investigation. He now ran his own private detective agency, and Victoria knew she was going to need his skills to uncover whatever Margaret Hartwell was hiding. As she walked to her car, Victoria felt a mixture of anger and determination settling in her chest. Eleanor had always fought for truth and justice in her humanitarian work. Now, Victoria would fight for truth and justice in her sister's memory. She didn't know yet what she was up against, but she knew that the empty pedestal in Elena's memorial wing was just the beginning of something much larger and more sinister than simple unauthorized renovations. Tomorrow, she would start getting answers. And she wouldn't stop until she found every missing piece of her sister's life, no matter where that search might lead her. Frank Morrison hadn't changed much in the 2 years since Victoria had left the insurance investigation business. He still wore the same style of rumpled brown jacket, still drank his coffee black, and still had the ability to notice details that others missed. They met at a small cafe near Victoria's apartment, where the morning crowd provided perfect cover for a private conversation. "So, tell me about this memorial situation," Frank said, settling into the booth across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug as he listened intently. Victoria spread the photographs she'd taken the previous evening across the table. Everything personal, everything that made Elena's memorial wing actually about Elena, has been removed. Margaret Hartwell claims it's for improvements and renovations, but she's lying. Frank studied the photographs, his experienced eyes cataloguing the empty display cases and vacant pedestals. "What's your gut telling you?" "That this isn't about renovations. Someone is systematically removing evidence of Elena's life and work from that memorial wing, and I need to know why." Frank leaned back in his seat. "What do you know about this Margaret Hartwell?" Victoria pulled out a folder sheet prepared. "Elena's best friend from college. They stayed close through Elena's humanitarian work. Margaret became director of the Whitmore Foundation about 5 years ago. She was the one who helped arrange the memorial wing after Elena's death."
"And she has access to everything?"
Complete access. As foundation director, she controls all the displays and has keys to everything.
Frank nodded slowly. "What about the foundation itself? Who owns it? Who funds it?" "That's where things get interesting," Victoria said, sliding another document across the table. "I did some preliminary research last night. The Whitmore Foundation was established by the estate of Charles Whitmore, a shipping magnate who died 20 years ago. But the current board of directors is small, only 3 people. Margaret Hartwell, Dr. Richard Blackwood, and someone named Alexander Cross." "Alexander Cross," Frank repeated. "That name sounds familiar. Let me check something." He pulled out his phone and made a few quick searches. Cross Holdings International, real estate development, import/export, some charity work. But there are some questions about how he made his money so quickly. Victoria felt a chill of anticipation. What kind of questions? The kind that involve expensive lawyers and sealed court records. Nothing proven, but his name has come up in connection with some questionable art sales and antiquities trading. They spent the next hour going through everything Victoria knew about Elena's life and work, looking for connections to the foundation and its board members. Elena's charitable work had taken her around the world, and she'd accumulated a substantial collection of art and artifacts from the cultures she'd worked with, all legitimate purchases or gifts from grateful communities. "Victoria," Frank said, leaning forward, "what exactly was in Elena's personal collection? The items that were displayed in the memorial wing?" Victoria consulted her notes. Her awards and recognition certificates, obviously. Personal photographs from her travels and work. Some small art pieces and sculptures from artists she supported, like that bronze sculpture by Marcus Rivera. A collection of traditional crafts and jewelry from communities she worked with, her journals and correspondence. And then there were some more valuable pieces. More valuable how? Elena had inherited some family jewelry and art from our grandmother. She also purchased some pieces during her travels. A small jade collection from her work in Asia. Some Native American pottery from a project in New Mexico. A few African masks that were gifts from village elders. Nothing extremely valuable individually, but collectively worth maybe $50,000. Frank whistled softly. That's enough to make someone pay attention. Especially if they needed quick money and thought no one would notice missing items from a memorial display. Victoria felt her anger rising again. You think Margaret is stealing from Elena's memorial to fence the items? It's one possibility, but let's dig deeper before we jump to conclusions. I want to know more about this Alexander Cross and his connection to the foundation. They agreed that Frank would investigate Cross Holdings International and its business practices, while Victoria would try to trace what had happened to Elena's missing items. Frank also suggested they needed to get inside the foundation after hours to see what they could find in areas not open to the public. That's breaking and entering, Frank. That's gathering evidence, he corrected with a slight smile. You're Elena's heir and the executor of the memorial agreement. You have a right to know what's being done with her possessions. Victoria spent the rest of the morning visiting art galleries and antique shops in the city, showing photographs of Elena's missing pieces and asking if anyone had seen similar items for sale. It was tedious work, but it was the kind of methodical investigation that had made her successful in insurance fraud cases. At the fourth gallery she visited, a small establishment in the arts district called Meridian Fine Arts, the owner's reaction to Elena's photographs was immediate and telling. "Oh yes," said Patricia Lansing, the gallery owner, studying the photograph of Elena's jade collection. "These pieces came through here about 2 months ago. Beautiful work, very authentic." The seller said they were from an estate liquidation. Victoria's heart began to race. "Do you remember who sold them to you?"
Patricia consulted her records.
"A woman named Margaret Hartwell. She had proper documentation showing she was authorized to sell the pieces on behalf of the estate." Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "Are the pieces still here?" "No, I sold them to a private collector in Chicago last month. But I keep detailed records of all transactions." Patricia pulled out a file folder. The documentation Ms. Hartwell provided showed that these items were part of the Elena Sterling estate liquidation, authorized by the Whitmore Foundation as the estate's representative. Victoria stared at the paperwork, seeing Margaret's signature on documents that gave her authority to sell Elena's personal possessions. The authorization appeared to be legitimate, bearing the official letterhead of the Whitmore Foundation and what looked like proper legal formatting. "Miss Lansing, I'm Elena Sterling's sister and the actual executor of her estate. These items were never authorized for sale. They were stolen from her memorial display." Patricia's face went pale. "Oh my God, I had no idea." The documentation looked completely legitimate. Victoria studied the paperwork more carefully. The authorization was dated 6 weeks earlier, and it specifically listed Elena's jade collection as surplus memorial items being liquidated to support ongoing charitable work. It was signed not only by Margaret Hartwell but also by Dr. Pater, Richard Blackwood, as the Foundation's legal advisor. "Patricia, I need copies of everything related to this transaction. And I need to know if Ms. Hartwell has brought any other items here for sale." While Patricia gathered the documentation, Victoria called Frank with the news. His response was immediate and grim. "Victoria, if they're systematically selling Elena's collection through legitimate art dealers with forged documentation, this is much bigger than simple theft. This is organized fraud."
What do you mean? Think about it. They're not just grabbing items and running.
They're creating a paper trail that makes the sales appear legal. They're liquidating Elena's estate piece by piece, and they're doing it in a way that protects them from prosecution. Patricia returned with copies of all the paperwork, including photographs of the jade pieces and contact information for the Chicago collector who had purchased them. "Ms. Lansing," Victoria said, "if other items from the Elena Sterling Memorial come through your gallery, please contact me immediately before any sales are completed." As Victoria left the gallery, her phone rang. It was David Chen, her lawyer. "Victoria, I sent that formal inquiry to the Whitmore Foundation's legal department this morning. I just received a response, and you're not going to like it." "What did they say?" "They're claiming that as the memorial's custodian, they have the right to liquidate surplus items to fund ongoing maintenance and improvements to the display. They're citing a clause in the memorial agreement that allows for appropriate stewardship of memorial assets." Victoria stopped walking. "David, I read that agreement. There's no clause that gives them the right to sell Elena's personal possessions. I'm looking at their response right now, and they're referencing an addendum to the original agreement, an addendum that I don't have in my files." Victoria felt a chill of realization. They're creating false documentation to cover their theft. That's what it looks like. I'm going to need to see this supposed addendum and compare it to our original agreement. But Victoria, if they're forging legal documents, this is criminal fraud on a significant scale. Victoria spent the rest of the afternoon visiting more galleries and antique shops. At 2 additional locations, she found evidence that Elena's items had been sold through the same process. Legitimate-looking documentation from the Whitmore Foundation authorizing the liquidation of memorial assets. By evening, she had identified at least $15,000 worth of Elena's possessions that had been sold through various dealers over the past 3 months. Each sale had been accompanied by official-looking paperwork bearing Margaret Hartwell's signature and the Foundation's letterhead. She met Frank for dinner at a restaurant near the Foundation building, where they could observe the evening activities while discussing their findings.
It's definitely organized, Frank reported.
I spent the day researching Alexander Cross and his business associates. Cross Holdings International has been linked to several questionable art and antiquities transactions over the past 5 years. Nothing criminal charges could be brought on, but enough suspicious activity to establish a pattern. Victoria showed Frank the documentation she'd collected from the galleries. They're not just stealing, Frank. They're running a sophisticated fraud operation using the Foundation as a front. Frank studied the paperwork carefully. These documents are very good forgeries, professional quality. The kind that requires someone with legal knowledge and access to official letterhead and seals. Dr. Richard Blackwood. He's listed as the Foundation's legal advisor on all these authorizations. So, we have Margaret Hartwell with access to Elena's possessions, Alexander Cross with connections to questionable art sales, and Dr. Penn? Richard Blackwood providing the legal framework to make it all appear legitimate. Victoria looked out the restaurant window at the Foundation building, its upper floors now dark for the evening. But why Elena's memorial specifically? There must be other valuable items in the Foundation's collection. Frank was quiet for a moment, and Victoria could see him working through possibilities. Maybe it's not about the value of the items. Maybe it's about the fact that Elena's memorial doesn't get many visitors. You said yourself you hadn't been there in 6 months. Who else would notice if things went missing? Elena didn't have any other close family. Most of her friends were scattered around the world because of her humanitarian work. I might be the only person who would notice the missing items, which makes Elena's collection the perfect target for a long-term theft operation. Victoria felt a surge of anger and determination. They picked the wrong memorial to steal from, Frank. Elena spent her life fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Now I'm going to fight for her. Frank smiled grimly. What did you have in mind? You mentioned getting into the Foundation after hours. I think it's time we found out what else Margaret Hartwell and her associates are hiding. They spent the rest of the evening planning their approach to the Foundation building. Frank had maintained his contacts in the security industry from his investigation days, and he was confident he could get them inside without triggering alarms. Tomorrow night, Frank said as they prepared to leave the restaurant. But Victoria, if we find what I think we're going to find in there, this case is going to get much more dangerous. Are you prepared for that? Victoria thought about Elena's empty memorial wing, about the missing bronze sculpture, and the jade collection already sold to strangers in other cities. She thought about Margaret Hartwell's lies and the forged documents that made theft look legal. Elena never backed down from fighting for what was right, even when it put her in danger. I'm not going to start now. As they walked to their cars, Victoria looked up at the Foundation building one more time. Tomorrow night, she would finally get the answers she needed. But she was beginning to understand that those answers might reveal something much darker than simple theft. The empty pedestal in Elena's memorial wing wasn't just missing a sculpture. It was missing the truth about what had happened to her sister's legacy, and possibly about what had happened to Elena herself. The Whitmore Foundation building stood empty and imposing in the midnight darkness, its glass facade reflecting the scattered streetlights like a giant mirror. Victoria and Frank waited in his car across the street, watching for security patrols and late-night staff who might complicate their plans. The building has a standard security system, Frank explained quietly, checking his equipment one more time. Motion sensors in the main hallways, but not in individual offices. The cameras are on a loop system that my contact was able to access remotely. We'll have a 40-minute window before the system cycles back to live monitoring. Victoria felt her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She'd never done anything like this before, but the anger over Elena's violated memorial had pushed her past her usual caution.
Marcus, the security guard, leaves at 11:30, Victoria said, watching the building entrance.
His replacement doesn't arrive until 6 in the morning. That's our window. They crossed the street at 12:15, moving quickly but casually toward the building's side entrance. Frank's security contact had provided them with a key card that would get them through the main doors without triggering alarms. The building felt different at night, hollow and echoing, with emergency lighting casting strange shadows along the familiar hallways. Victoria led the way to the administrative offices on the second floor, where Margaret Hartwell's office occupied a corner suite with windows overlooking the city. "What exactly are we looking for?" Frank whispered as he worked on Margaret's office lock. "Financial records, correspondence about the memorial wing, anything that shows the connection between Margaret, Dr. Blackwood, and Alexander Cross." Victoria kept watch down the hallway. "And I want to find out where they're really storing Elena's missing items." Margaret's office was decorated with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and careful taste. Degrees and awards lined the walls, and photographs showed Margaret with various politicians and celebrities at Foundation events. But it was the desk that drew Victoria's attention, specifically the locked drawer that Frank quickly opened with his tools. Inside the drawer, Victoria found a file folder labeled Sterling Memorial, Liquidation Authorization. Her hands trembled as she opened it and began reading by flashlight. The documents inside were far more extensive than anything Patricia Lansing had shown her at the art gallery. There were detailed inventories of Elena's possessions, appraisal values for each item, and a systematic plan for selling them through different dealers to avoid detection. But it was the correspondence at the bottom of the file that made Victoria's blood run cold. A letter from Dr. Dashbelay. Richard Blackwood to Margaret, dated 3 weeks after Elena's death, outlined a plan to maximize the financial potential of the memorial assets while maintaining the appearance of proper stewardship. The letter specifically mentioned Alexander Cross as having connections in the private art market that could facilitate discreet sales. "Frank, look at this." Victoria showed him a spreadsheet that detailed projected sales income from Elena's collection. The total estimated value was over $200,000, far more than Victoria had realized her sister's possessions were worth. But there was something else in the file that made Victoria's heart stop. A medical examiner's report about Elena's death marked confidential, private investigation. Victoria had never seen this report before. The official cause of Elena's death had been listed as accidental drowning during a late-night swim at her lake house. But this private report raised questions about inconsistencies in the physical evidence and suggested that Elena's death might not have been accidental. "Why would Margaret have a private investigation report about Elena's death?" Victoria whispered. Frank studied the document carefully. "Look at who commissioned this report. Cross Holdings International. Alexander Cross paid for a private investigation into your sister's death just 2 weeks after she died." Victoria felt the room spinning around her. "Frank, what if Elena's death wasn't an accident? What if someone killed her for her collection?" "That's a serious accusation, Victoria. We need more evidence before we go down that path." They photographed everything in Margaret's file, then moved to search the rest of her office. In a cabinet behind her desk, Victoria found correspondence between Margaret and several art dealers, detailing the systematic sale of Elena's possessions over the past 6 months. But it was in Margaret's computer that they found the most damaging evidence. Frank was able to bypass her password and access her email files, where they discovered months of correspondence between Margaret, Dr. Blackwood, and Alexander Cross. The emails revealed the full scope of their operation. They had been systematically targeting memorial displays and estate collections throughout the Foundation, not just Elena's. Over the past 2 years, they had liquidated assets from at least 6 different memorial collections, generating over $1 million in illegal sales. Elena's collection had been their most recent and most valuable target, but the emails suggested they had been planning to expand their operation to other charitable foundations in the city. "Victoria, look at this email from Cross to Margaret, dated 2 days before Elena's death." Victoria leaned over Frank's shoulder to read the message on the screen. "The Sterling collection represents a significant opportunity, but we need to move carefully. E.S. has been asking questions about the Foundation's financial management. Suggest we wait until after the situation resolves itself." "The situation resolves itself," Victoria repeated slowly. Elena was asking questions about the Foundation's finances, and 2 days later she was dead. Frank saved copies of the emails to a flash drive while Victoria continued searching through Margaret's office. In a locked file cabinet, she found something that made her gasp audibly. Elena's personal journals, the ones that should have been displayed in her memorial wing, were stacked in the bottom drawer of Margaret's filing cabinet. Victoria pulled them out with shaking hands, recognizing Elena's distinctive handwriting on the leather covers.
She opened the most recent journal, dated just days before Elena's death. The entries were filled with Elena's growing concerns about financial irregularities at the Whitmore Foundation. "I've been reviewing the Foundation's annual reports," Elena had written. "And the numbers don't add up. Large donations are being recorded, but there's no documentation showing how the money is being spent on actual charitable work. Margaret keeps avoiding my questions, but I'm going to demand a full financial audit." The next entry was even more troubling. "I found documents in Margaret's office that suggest money is being diverted through Cross Holdings International. I don't understand the full scope yet, but I think Margaret might be embezzling foundation funds. I'm going to confront her tomorrow and demand explanations." The journal entries stopped there. Elena had died that night. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that her sister had discovered the theft operation and had been killed to prevent her from exposing it. Frank, Elena knew. She found out what they were doing, and they killed her for it. Frank looked at the journal entries and the correspondence they'd found. "This is circumstantial evidence, Victoria. Suggestive, but not proof of murder. Then we need to find proof." They left Margaret's office and made their way to the Foundation's storage areas in the basement. Frank's keycard got them through several security doors, and they found themselves in a large warehouse space filled with items from various Foundation collections. But it was in a small, climate-controlled storage room that they made their most shocking discovery. Elena's missing possessions weren't being stored for renovation, they were being prepared for shipment. Boxes labeled with Elena's name contained her awards, photographs and personal items, all carefully packaged as if for transport. Victoria found the bronze sculpture from Marcus Rivera sitting in a crate marked for delivery to Alexander Cross's private residence. The shipping label was dated for the following day. "They're not even trying to sell this through dealers," Victoria realized. "Cross is just taking it for himself." Frank was examining other crates in the storage room. "Victoria, look at this. These boxes are from other memorial collections. The Henderson Memorial, the Morrison Family Foundation, the Children's Relief Memorial. They've been systematically looting memorial displays throughout the city." Victoria felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd discovered. This wasn't just about Elena's memorial. It was about dozens of families whose loved ones' memories were being violated for profit. "We have enough evidence now," Frank said, packing up his equipment. "We need to get out of here and turn this over to the police." But as they prepared to leave the storage room, they heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Frank immediately turned off his flashlight and motioned for Victoria to hide behind a stack of crates. The storage room door opened, and Margaret Hartwell walked in, followed by a man Victoria didn't recognize. Even in the dim emergency lighting, Victoria could see that Margaret looked exhausted and frightened. "The Sterling woman has been asking too many questions," Margaret was saying. "She visited 3 art galleries yesterday, and Patricia Lansing called to warn me that Victoria knows about the Jade Collection sale." The man's voice was calm but menacing. "I told you this would happen if you got careless, Margaret." Elena Sterling was asking questions, and now her sister is following the same path. "What do you want me to do, Alexander?" "We can't just make Victoria disappear like we did with Elena." Victoria felt Frank's hand on her arm, keeping her still as they listened to Margaret's confession. "Actually, we can," Alexander Cross replied. "Victoria Sterling is a former insurance investigator with a history of taking risks. It wouldn't be surprising if she had an accident while pursuing a case that got too dangerous for her." Margaret's voice cracked with fear. "I never agreed to murder when this started." "You said Elena's death was an accident." "Elena's death was necessary," Cross said coldly. "She was going to expose our operation and destroy everything we'd built, just like her sister is trying to do now." Victoria felt her legs shaking as she realized she was listening to Elena's murderer confess to the crime. But Cross was still talking, and what he said next made her blood run cold. "The difference is that this time, we're prepared. Victoria Sterling won't have the chance to cause us problems. Neither will that private investigator she's been meeting with." Frank tensed beside Victoria, and she realized that Cross knew about their investigation.
How do you know about the private investigator?
Margaret asked. "Because I've been having Victoria Sterling followed since she first showed up at the memorial wing 3 days ago. Frank Morrison is a former insurance investigator who specializes in fraud cases. Together, they represent a significant threat to our operation." Cross pulled out his phone and made a call. "It's me." "Yes, they're both here in the building right now. Storage room B12. "No. I want it to look like they broke in to steal valuable items and were killed by security guards who surprised them in the act." Victoria felt panic rising in her chest as she realized they were trapped. Cross had known about their investigation all along, and they had walked directly into a trap.
Frank was already moving, pulling Victoria toward an emergency exit at the far end of the storage room. But as they emerged from behind the crates, Cross spotted them immediately. "There they are," he called out. "Don't let them reach that exit." Victoria and Frank ran through the storage room, dodging between crates and boxes as Cross and Margaret gave chase. Frank managed to get the emergency door open, but as they burst through into the alley behind the building, they found two men waiting for them with guns. "Cross said you might try to leave this way," one of the men said with a cold smile. Victoria realized that their investigation into Elena's memorial had uncovered something much larger and more dangerous than simple theft. Elena had been murdered to protect a criminal operation worth millions of dollars, and now Victoria and Frank were about to meet the same fate. But as the gunmen raised their weapons, Frank suddenly threw himself sideways, tackling Victoria to the ground just as shots rang out in the darkness of the alley. The investigation that had started with an empty pedestal in Elena's memorial wing was about to become a fight for their lives. The gunshots echoed through the alley as Victoria and Frank rolled behind a dumpster, concrete fragments spraying around them from the bullets hitting the brick wall. Frank's quick thinking had saved their lives, but they were still trapped with armed killers between them and freedom. "Frank, are you hit?" Victoria whispered urgently. "I'm okay, but we can't stay here long." Frank pulled out his phone, trying to dial 911, but there was no signal in the narrow alley between buildings. They could hear Cross shouting orders to his men. "Find them. They can't have gotten far, and we can't afford to let them escape with what they know." Victoria's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. The alley was a dead end in one direction, with only the foundation building's rear entrance. In the other direction, it opened onto a busy street. But Cross's men were positioned between them and that escape route. "The fire escape," Frank whispered, pointing to a metal ladder mounted on the building across from the foundation. "If we can reach it, we might be able to get high enough to get a phone signal." They waited for a moment when Cross's men were focused on searching the other end of the alley, then made a desperate sprint across the open space. Victoria's heart pounded as she climbed the fire escape ladder, expecting to feel bullets hitting her at any moment. But they made it to the first landing, and Frank's phone finally found a signal. He immediately dialed 911 while Victoria kept watch below. "This is Frank Morrison, private investigator. We're at the Whitmore Foundation building, 4825 Riverside Drive. We're being shot at by armed men in the rear alley. We have evidence of multiple murders and a major theft operation. Send everything you have." As Frank gave their location to the emergency operator, Victoria saw Cross and his men emerge from the building's rear exit. Cross looked up and spotted them on the fire escape. "Get up there and kill them both," Cross ordered. "Make it look like they fell while trying to break into the building." But as Cross's men started climbing toward them, Victoria heard the most beautiful sound in the world, police sirens approaching from multiple directions. Frank's call had been taken seriously, and it sounded like half the city's police force was responding. Cross heard the sirens too, and his confident demeanor suddenly changed to panic. "Get back to the cars. We're leaving now." "What about them?" one of his men asked, pointing up at Victoria and Frank. "Leave them. Without the evidence from the foundation, they can't prove anything." Victoria watched in frustration as Cross and his men disappeared into the darkness of the alley, escaping before the police arrived. But she realized that Cross had made a crucial mistake. He didn't know that Frank had already copied all the evidence from Margaret's computer and taken photographs of the stolen items in the storage room. The police arrived within minutes, flooding the area with patrol cars and officers. Detective Sarah Martinez, a veteran investigator Victoria had worked with during her insurance fraud days, took charge of the scene. "Victoria, what the hell are you doing on a fire escape at 1 a.m? Detective Martinez asked as Victoria and Frank climbed down to meet the officers. "Sarah, we stumbled onto something huge. Murder, theft, fraud, and it all connects to my sister Elena's death." Over the next several hours, Victoria and Frank walked the police through everything they'd discovered. They provided copies of the stolen documents, the photographs of Elena's missing possessions, and the recorded confession they'd overheard in the storage room. Detective Martinez assembled a team of investigators to search the foundation building, while Victoria and Frank gave detailed statements about their investigation. By dawn, the police had gathered enough evidence to issue arrest warrants for Margaret Hartwell, Dr. Forwell, Richard Blackwood, and Alexander Cross. Margaret was arrested at her home at 6:30 a.m., still in her pajamas, and clearly exhausted from the night's events.
She broke down completely when confronted with the evidence, confessing to her role in the theft operation and providing details about Cross's other criminal activities. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," Margaret sobbed during her interrogation, which Victoria was allowed to observe. When Elena started asking questions about the Foundation's finances, Alexander said we just needed to scare her into backing off. But then she found those documents in my office and she was going to expose everything. Detective Martinez leaned forward. "So you killed her?" "Alexander killed her. He made it look like an accident, like she had gone swimming late at night and drowned. But Elena never swam alone at night. She was terrified of dark water." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face as she heard the confirmation of what she'd suspected. Elena had been murdered simply for trying to protect the charitable work she cared so deeply about. Dr. Richard Blackwood was arrested at his law office, where police found additional evidence of forged documents and fraudulent authorizations. His involvement went back over 3 years, and he had provided legal cover for Cross's operation across multiple charitable foundations. But Alexander Cross proved more elusive. When police arrived at his address, they found that he had already fled, leaving behind only empty offices and a trail of false identities. However, the evidence Victoria and Frank had gathered provided enough information for federal authorities to freeze his assets and issue international warrants for his arrest. Over the following weeks, the full scope of the criminal operation was revealed. Cross had targeted memorial displays and charitable collections because they received less scrutiny than other valuable assets. Families trusted that their loved ones' possessions were being respectfully preserved, making it easy for thieves to gradually liquidate items without detection. The investigation revealed that Cross's operation had stolen over $3 million worth of art, jewelry, and artifacts from charitable foundations across the city. Elena's collection had been one of their largest single scores, but it was also the one that led to their downfall. Because Elena herself had discovered the theft, Victoria worked closely with law enforcement to help recover stolen items and return them to their proper memorial displays. Many of Elena's possessions were recovered from the Foundation's storage facility, though some pieces that had already been sold required extensive effort to track down and retrieve. The bronze sculpture by Marcus Rivera was recovered from Cross's abandoned office, still in its shipping crate. When Victoria finally returned it to its proper place on the pedestal in Elena's memorial wing, she felt a sense of completion that had been missing since Elena's death. The Whitmore Foundation was placed under new management, with a board of directors chosen by the city's Charitable Oversight Committee. The memorial collections were restored to their original states, and new security measures were implemented to prevent future theft. Margaret Hartwell was sentenced to 15 years in prison for her role in Elena's murder and the theft operation.
Doctor?
Richard Blackwood received 12 years for fraud and conspiracy. Alexander Cross remained at large, but Victoria knew that international law enforcement agencies were actively pursuing him. 6 months after that night on the fire escape, Victoria stood in Elena's memorial wing, which had been completely restored with additional security and better preservation techniques. All of Elena's possessions had been returned, and new displays had been added to tell the story of Elena's humanitarian work in greater detail. The bronze sculpture by Marcus Rivera sat on its pedestal, hands reaching toward each other in a symbol of connection and hope. But now it represented something more to Victoria. It represented the truth that Elena had died trying to protect, and the justice that Victoria had fought to secure. Frank joined her in the memorial wing, carrying a newspaper with the headline, "International Fugitive Captured in Morocco." Alexander Cross had finally been arrested and was being extradited to face charges for Elena's murder and the theft operation. "It's over," Frank said simply. Victoria nodded, but her eyes remained focused on Elena's photograph, the one showing her bright smile as she worked with children in Cambodia. Elena always said that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep people try to bury it.
She would be proud of what you did, Frank replied.
"You didn't just get justice for her death. You saved dozens of other families from having their loved ones' memories violated." Victoria had received dozens of thank you letters from families whose memorial collections had been recovered and restored. Each letter reminded her that Elena's death, while tragic, had ultimately prevented many other families from experiencing the same violation of their loved ones' memories. As she prepared to leave the memorial wing, Victoria noticed a new addition to Elena's display, a small placard that had been added by the Foundation's new management. It read, "In memory of Elena Sterling, who died fighting for truth and justice. Her legacy lives on in the lives she touched and the justice she inspired." Victoria smiled as she read the words. Elena's memorial wing was no longer just a display of her possessions and achievements,
It was a testament to her courage and her commitment to protecting others, even in death. The empty pedestal that had started Victoria's investigation was now filled not just with Elena's bronze sculpture, but with the knowledge that her sister's killers had been brought to justice and that her memory had been fully restored. As Victoria left the Whitmore Foundation building for the last time, she felt Elena's presence with her in a way she hadn't since her sister's death. The investigation that had begun with missing artifacts had revealed the truth about Elena's life, her death, and her enduring impact on the world. Elena Sterling had spent her life fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. In the end, her sister Victoria had fought for her, ensuring that Elena's memory would be preserved with the truth and dignity she deserved. The bronze sculpture's reaching hands would continue to symbolize connection and hope for visitors to Elena's memorial wing. But for Victoria, they now also symbolized the unbreakable bond between sisters and the promise that love and truth would always triumph over greed and deception. Elena's story was complete, her legacy secure, and her justice finally achieved. The empty pedestal would never be empty again.